In moments of crisis, narratives tend to move faster than facts. In recent weeks, as the conflict involving Iran has intensified, a familiar set of questions has begun to dominate public discourse. Critics have asked whether the president miscalculated Iran's resilience, whether the operation can truly be called a success while key choke points remain contested, whether there was ever a clear endgame, and whether this moment echoes past failures in the Middle East. These are serious questions. They deserve serious answers grounded not in speculation or political opportunism, but in strategic reality. The suggestion that the president miscalculated Iran's resilience rests on a misunderstanding of both the nature of this conflict and the objectives of the operation. No credible military planner ever assumed that a regime like Iran's, deeply entrenched, ideologically driven, and structured around decentralized power networks, would collapse overnight. That was never the premise. The objective was not to produce instant political transformation, but to degrade capabilities that posed a direct and growing threat to the United States and its allies. Those capabilities included ballistic missile systems, drone networks, naval assets used to disrupt shipping, and the infrastructure supporting nuclear ambitions. These are measurable targets, these are strategic assets, and these are precisely the areas where the operation has delivered tangible results. Iran's ability to project force has been significantly reduced. Its missile output has declined. Its naval capacity has been weakened. Its ability to coordinate large-scale attacks has been disrupted. These outcomes do not always produce dramatic headlines, but they matter in the long arc of security. They change the calculus of risk. They limit the options available to an adversary. They buy time and space for diplomatic and economic pressure to take effect. To frame the absence of immediate regime collapse as a miscalculation is to impose an unrealistic standard on a conflict that was never defined by that objective in the first place. At the same time, it is important to acknowledge that Iran remains capable of inflicting disruption, particularly in areas like the Strait of Hormuz. That fact does not contradict the progress that has been made. It underscores the complexity of the environment. The Strait of Hormuz is not a conventional battlefield. It is a narrow, heavily trafficked maritime corridor where even limited actions can have outsized global consequences. Control in such a space is not binary. It is contested, fluid, and influenced by a range of factors including geography, international presence, and asymmetric tactics. The administration's position has been clear. Success is not defined by the elimination of every single threat overnight, but by the systematic reduction of an adversary's ability to weaponize those threats. Iran's continued attempts to disrupt shipping are not evidence of strength. They are evidence of constraint. When a regime shifts from projecting power outward to targeting commercial vessels in narrow corridors, it reflects a narrowing of options, not an expansion of them. It reflects pressure, it reflects degradation, it reflects a strategic environment in which traditional avenues of influence have been limited. Calling the operation a success, therefore, is not a declaration of finality, it is an assessment of trajectory. It is an acknowledgement that the balance of capability has shifted in meaningful ways. It is a recognition that the threats which prompted action in the first place have been addressed in part, and continue to be addressed through coordinated efforts. Success in this context is incremental, not instantaneous. It is measured over time, not in single moments. The question of whether there was ever a clear endgame is one that often arises in complex conflicts. It is also one that is frequently framed in overly simplistic terms. An endgame is not always a fixed point on a timeline, it is a set of conditions. In this case, those conditions have been consistently articulated. The degradation of Iran's ability to threaten U.S. forces and allies, the disruption of its capacity to destabilize the region, and the prevention of nuclear escalation. These are not vague aspirations. They are concrete strategic objectives that guide decision-making at every stage of the operation. Strategy in a dynamic environment requires adaptation. It requires the ability to respond to changing conditions without losing sight of core objectives. That is not improvisation, that is competence. The battlefield evolves, intelligence evolves, adversaries adjust. A rigid plan that ignores these realities is not a strength, it is a liability. The administration has approached this situation with a framework that allows for flexibility while maintaining strategic coherence. That is why decisions are informed by real-time intelligence, by the assessments of military commanders, and by ongoing coordination with international partners. To characterize this approach as improvisation is to misunderstand the nature of modern conflict. There is a difference between reacting without direction and adapting within a defined strategy. The former leads to chaos. The latter leads to resilience. The administration has consistently operated within the latter framework, making adjustments where necessary while remaining focused on the objectives that define success. Comparisons to past conflicts in the Middle East are inevitable, but they are often drawn without sufficient attention to the differences that matter. Previous engagements in the region frequently involved large-scale ground deployments, open-ended nation-building efforts, and unclear exit strategies. Those elements are not present here. The current approach is defined by targeted operations, limited objectives, and a deliberate effort to avoid the kind of prolonged entanglement that characterized earlier eras. There is no attempt to occupy territory. There is no effort to impose a political system through force. There is no commitment to an indefinite presence without defined goals. Instead, the focus is on specific threats, specific capabilities, and specific outcomes. That distinction is not rhetorical, it is operational. It shapes how resources are allocated, how missions are conducted, and how success is evaluated. It is also important to recognize the broader context in which this conflict exists. The Middle East today is not the same as it was decades ago. Regional dynamics have shifted, alliances have evolved, economic interdependencies have deepened, the global community is more interconnected, and the consequences of instability are more immediate and far-reaching. Any strategy must account for these realities. It must balance the need for security with the imperative of avoiding unnecessary escalation. The administration's approach reflects that balance. It combines military action with diplomatic engagement. It integrates economic measures with security operations. It seeks to contain threats without expanding the scope of conflict beyond what is necessary. This is not a maximalist strategy. It is a calibrated one. It is designed to address immediate risks while preserving the possibility of long-term stability. Critics often frame the situation in stark terms, suggesting that anything short of total and immediate resolution constitutes failure. That perspective may be politically convenient, but it is strategically flawed. Complex conflicts do not resolve themselves on command. They require sustained effort, coordinated action, and a clear understanding of what is achievable. Progress is often uneven. Setbacks occur, but those realities do not negate the importance of forward movement. The question is not whether the situation is perfect. The question is whether it is improving in ways that align with strategic objectives. By that measure, there is evidence of progress. Threat capabilities have been reduced. International coordination has increased. The risks posed by unchecked escalation have been mitigated, even if not entirely eliminated. These are meaningful developments in a challenging environment. At the same time, vigilance remains essential. The situation in the Strait of Hormuz continues to demand attention. The safety of global shipping routes is a priority not only for the United States, but for the entire international community. Efforts to protect those routes are ongoing, involving cooperation among naval forces, coordination with commercial operators, and engagement with regional partners. Stability in this area is not guaranteed. It must be maintained through consistent effort. The broader goal remains clear: to ensure that critical international waterways remain open, that global commerce can continue without disruption, and that the rules governing international conduct are upheld. These are not abstract principles. They are the foundation of economic stability and international cooperation. When they are challenged, the response must be measured, but it must also be firm. In addressing the current situation, it is important to separate narrative from reality. Narratives can be shaped by political agendas, by selective interpretation of events, and by the natural human tendency to seek simple explanations for complex problems. Reality is more nuanced. It requires an understanding of context, of strategy, and of the constraints that shape decision-making. The administration's approach to this conflict reflects an understanding of those nuances. It recognizes that strength and restraint are not mutually exclusive. It acknowledges that progress can be incremental. It accepts that uncertainty is an inherent part of any complex operation, and it remains focused on the objectives that define success, even as the path toward those objectives evolves. In the end, the measure of leadership is not the absence of challenges, but the ability to navigate them effectively. The situation involving Iran presents significant challenges. It involves competing interests, evolving threats, and high stakes for global stability. Addressing those challenges requires clarity of purpose, flexibility of approach, and a commitment to the principles that guide responsible action. The United States remains engaged, vigilant, and prepared to continue working with partners around the world to manage this situation. The goal is not to create new conflicts, but to prevent existing ones from escalating further. The goal is not to impose outcomes, but to shape conditions in ways that promote stability. And the goal is not to achieve perfection, but to make progress that enhances security and reduces risk. These are not easy tasks. They do not lend themselves to simple answers or immediate conclusions, but they are necessary tasks. They are the responsibilities that come with leadership in an interconnected world, and they are the standards by which this administration's actions should be judged not by the speed of headlines, but by the substance of outcomes.